This program is brought to you by 3C TV. Like what you learned? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up on the latest 3C TV programs.
What I would like to do tonight is take a look at some art and architecture of the Islamic world. I'd like to look at early art from the Umayyad dynasty, talk about the formation of the mosque, look at the idea of calligraphy or beautiful writing, what is often described as the marvelous gift of Arabic, as a basis for a lot of the patterning and so on that creates the kind of beauty that we see here. I'd also like to discuss vegetal and geometric patterning, which is something as well that we see at this point, and discuss how this relates to the idea of paradise and the origins of the word paradise and why it's significant to the Arabs and then to the later Islamic world. And then I'd like to finally look at some of the later mosques, mausoleums, palaces, and a few examples of art of the figure, and actually finish with a couple of contemporary Islamic artworks. The art of the figure is not preeminent in this culture, and it has a lot to do with the origins of Islam. Islam, first of all, means devotion to God, or Allah. Those who practice such devotion and submit themselves to the will of Allah are Muslims. The Quran, which is the primary document of Islam, is comprised of collected revelations made to Muhammad and became the holy scriptures of Islam. The Arabic word for Quran means reading or recitation. So the original text of the Quran was recorded in the heavens according to the view of any Muslim from the beginning of time, and this revealed Quran corresponds to it word for word, and thus the Muslims for a long time were loath to translate it into any other language at all. Now, I kind of had to read from that to make sure I got this right. This idea of then the language as being a primary document will become prominent in the artwork of the time. What we're looking at right here, however, is not a religious document. It's a religious object. It's a secular object. This is a copper basin, but as you can see, it's inlaid with silver. It's highly ornate. It has these patterns, these very intricate vegetal patterns inlaid in silver, and then it has these registers, these areas here that have some figurative elements and so on. This would have been used for washing of hands and so on for special occasions. And it is a luxury item. It's fairly small in scale, and this is what's characteristic of a lot of this type of work, Muslim art. Let's see. This works. All right, a little look into the beginning of Islamic art. In this, what you can see is a very fast expansion of the Islamic world from the time of its origins with Muhammad and Hijra. Basically, we're looking at the calendar of 622 is the beginning point of Islamic history with Muhammad's flight to what is now the city of Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. If you look up here, you can see the city of Medina and Mecca here, which is at the center of the Islamic world. When you pray, one of the 5 pillars of faith, you always face Mecca. And from my youth, I always thought, well, you face the east, but if you're in the east already, sometimes you're facing south and so on. Thus the need for various devices to know where the direction of prayer should be, where Mecca is. And so astrolabes and compasses and so on were utilized to do that. In this image as well, we're going to look at Al-Andalus, which is southern Spain over here. We're also going to be looking at artwork from the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, primarily. And we'll look over here at some work from Persia up here, Baghdad, but further north, and so on. So those are some of the areas where we're going to explore this. Let's see. Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem. In the early Umayyad period, they conquered Jerusalem, a Christian city, and took the most prime plot of real estate in Jerusalem and put their own temple on it. This was formerly Solomon's temple, which had great, and well, still does have great significance in Jewish and Christian circles. And by placing their temple on this location, it is a very direct sign of victory, of conquering the foe, not only conquering the people, but also, in a sense, having preeminence in the belief system. However, one of the things that is very clear in looking at Islamic culture from this period and so on was the tolerance of the Islamic rulers. There is still, across the way, a competitor to Dome of the Rock, in fact, a similar kind of structure and so on. And this competitor was the Holy Sepulchre, a very sacred shrine of Christianity. And what we're seeing on the outside of this, along here, are sacred teachings of the Quran that very clearly advocate the idea of Allah as being one and not three, not Trinity. So, in a sense, attacking this idea of the Trinity, this basic belief system of Christianity, attacking the idea of the incarnation, and in a sense, also exhorting Muslim believers. So there was a very direct a very direct way of making this preeminent. Inside is this double ambulatory, which means to amble or to walk along. And you can see that here, the inner one, the outer one is where the photograph is taken from. As you note in this, as well as in this image, it's encrusted with these massive amounts of mosaics. Mosaics were used by the Byzantine culture at this time, and they were usually borders. They were usually used fairly sparely. The Islamic artists, however, used it in a very, extraordinarily vast manner, covering the area with the mosaics and using them as a way to kind of primarily visualize their imagery. The dome is wooden, actually, stuccoed and painted with gilded arabesques. And this has been renovated several different times. And one of the issues with this kind of building is how quickly it can age. They honored these buildings and thus renovated them fairly frequently. The last time they replaced almost all the tiles on the exterior of the building in the 1600s. The Dome of the Rock is not completely new. As you can see here, it's essentially based on an earlier Christian martyrium of Santa Costanza as an example. You can see the dome on the interior of here, very similar to here. The difference, however, and this is a primary difference, when you have these Christian buildings, they tend to be covered with brick and very muted, and you don't really know what the interior looks like. Though they have mosaics inside, the interior is very muted. On the other hand, the kind of decoration is forward and very dramatic with Islamic structures. The interior, you can see ambulatory, not a double, a single ambulatory, but a dome in the center as well. And it is actually on a rock, as you can see here. Within this, there are many different kinds of mosaics. In this case, there's motifs of jeweled plants, trees, and chalices. And this is a direct reference to this idea of paradise, sometimes considered also a way to show Muslim victory, or even referring back to Solomon's temple. This idea of paradise is really a garden. The idea is promoted, this earthly garden in heaven, and this image comes back to us many a time with the mosaics that we're seeing here. The Great Mosque at Damascus, an early Umayyad mosque that we see here, has a kind of interesting structure. As you can see, it has an internal courtyard, so this is often called a courtyard mosque. It has what looks like a kind of prayer hall or basilica on this side here, with a crossing area here, which is called a transept, has a dome over that. And this marks the spot, if you were to pray and you were to follow your eyes along that transept towards Mecca. So on the far wall of this, and we'll see that in a minute, we'll talk about that term, but right now what I want you to note is that there's a very old kind of wall going around this mosque, and that is the original wall. Everything else was torn down. And initially, this mosque was in common usage with Christians for about 7 decades, in fact. And it was later, at some point, torn down. This Christian basilica, which is a certain form which we'll look at in a minute, is also was to St. John the Baptist. There was a reliquary with parts of, or I haven't been there, the head of St. John. Anyway, something having to do with his decapitation is there, integrated into the actual mosque itself, and you can visit that, Christian or Muslim alike, and it still has great significance. This is a larger community mosque. Its functions were also social and political. The ruler would hold court here, in a sense, and there would be a larger kind of population that would come here. And this is often called the Masjid al-Jami, or the Mosque of the Community. Sometimes it's described as a Friday mosque. There are several other characteristics here. You can see the towers. These are called minarets. And if we look at the plan, we can see the prayer wall, the one facing towards mosque, is the one that is covered by the prayer hall. And this then is called the Qibla. The Qibla has, right in here, a small area, it's called the mihrab. It's a niche, and this niche then marks the direction of prayer. Now, the basilica plan is it's originally from the hypostyle hall of the Egyptians. The Romans took it on, and it became this three-aisled building. And if you look at the 3 aisles here, they tend to be moving in this direction, actually crossing the path of the worshipers who are looking towards the wall here and towards Mecca. Christians, however, saw this as a kind of trinity, where the 3 aisles invoke the idea of the Trinity. The central aisle, the nave, the altar would have been here, was the direction of worship. And so the Muslims flipped it around. Islamic way of worship changed it so that you're looking towards the wall here. In the courtyard here, you can see there's still a few, oops, I'm using the wrong thing here. A few mosaics up along here, and these are what's remaining after a fire that occurred in 1893 that destroyed most of the mosaics that were here. Some 43,000 square feet of mosaics were in this building. There was nothing like it in the ancient world. That's basically a little less than an acre of mosaics. So it was extraordinarily decorated, very, very lush and beautiful imagery and so on. What's left are a few examples, and we'll see that in a minute. Right here, this is the prayer hall that I was talking about. You can see basically towards the direction of where the altar would have been initially if it were a Christian church. Instead, the faithful pray to the wall to the right here. This is a mosaic, one of the few that remain, that depicts this idea of Muslim paradise as a garden, as a place like the Garden of Eden that is lush and abundant. If you can imagine, if you were an early adherent to the teachings of Allah, you would have come from the desert most likely, you would have been nomadic, you would have lived in a dry climate, and this would have been an extraordinary experience to actually see this kind of lush world that's here. The other thing that this is promoting is the idea of a new Rome. The new Rome that we're seeing here is an idea that for the Muslims, they felt, for the Umayyad dynasty, they felt that they, like Rome, were building an empire. And so this depicts that as well with the classical elements and so on that one sees here. This, you might say, is the Umayyad worldview. This is a Roman-style floor mosaic. It's a hunting scene, and it's transformed into an allegory of a world divided between Muslim and infidel. If you look at this, there is, what do we see? What do we see in this? Peace versus violence, right? And we see a tree of abundance that's dividing the two. The Umayyad Caliph would have sat at the head of this, and his audience would have been below, and to his left, if he were to pass judgment, would be those who had his favor. And I'm sorry, to his right, I'm turned around. To his right would be those who were, favored by him. To his left would be the punishment awaiting those who stepped out of the line. So we can see that in this image very clearly. And its position on the floor was a kind of a beautiful reminder of those arriving before the caliphate, that you had something to expect from him. In looking at this, the great mosque of Samarra in Iraq, the largest mosque at the time in the world, there's a couple of unusual things. First thing is we see the walls around the outside that used to have a forest of columns. The Qibla, the prayer wall, was up here. If you look in the center, at the center courtyard, it's very clear that this space was designed to hold thousands and thousands of people. If we look at this from the point where this is a large-scale version of what was initially Muhammad's own house, and the original idea of the mosque, a place for prostration, a place for prayer, is the location of what was initially the house of Muhammad. Muhammad had this central courtyard. He had a couple of covered walls there, and this is where people, the faithful, came and met. And so this was an adaptation to that. What we're seeing here is also a minaret, the Malwiya, the spiral minaret that's here. This was once thought of by people in the West is actually an ancient ziggurat, and it was mistakenly considered to be a Tower of Babel, like the ancient ziggurat, and mistakenly images of the ancient ziggurat were depicted here like this, rather than a much lower, much more horizontal kind of formalized mountain than this. This is about 165 feet high, and this is really quite extraordinary in this kind of spiral design. There's nothing else like this in the world. Sadly, as a result of the Iraq War and so on, this has gotten fairly damaged since this photograph. As you can see, it lines up directly with the direction of Mecca, which is over here in the Qibla wall, and the mihrab is right here. This is the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest place in Islamic culture, and the direction in which one prays. I would like right now to show you a short section here of a film having to do with writing, and we'll start with that right now. What we're going to be looking at is basically considering this idea of calligraphy, the word. The issue of iconoclasm is something that comes up. The word is something that is, since the Quran is the undisputed word of God given to humans through the Prophet Muhammad, was written in the miraculous gift of Arabic, it's a visual artifact of God's communication to the world. And that means that it becomes important as a vehicle for beauty, for what becomes the art of calligraphy, this idea of making beautiful writing. And in this case, a combination of calligraphy and also intricate, mathematically precise combinations are what give us ultimately the idea of Arabic. And these elements brought together create much of the kind of relationship of patterning of the kind of intense, delicate, and defining patterns that we see here. This, by the way, is an image of the Quran at the front in Kufic script, early blocky script.
In Muslim tradition, Islam began in 610 in a cave in Mecca, where an angel came upon the Prophet Muhammad and revealed to him the words of the Quran. In the first revelation, God proclaimed himself the Creator and said, "Read, for your Lord is the most generous, the one who taught the use of the pen, taught man what he did not know." More than poetry, more than a holy book, it was the very word of God.
For Christians, God's gift was his Son. He sent down his Son to save mankind. For Muslims, God sent down a revelation. So the parallel is between Christ and an oral revelation. Because God's gift to mankind in Islam is the Quran, writing becomes the central feature of Islamic culture. And the use of the word everywhere, from day-to-day objects to Quran manuscripts, is the one feature that separates Islamic culture from all others.
The earliest dated words of the Quran are found in a stone building in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred and politically charged cities in the world. Built in 692, it is called the Dome of the Rock.
The Dome of the Rock would have been a familiar building in terms of form. That is, the shape, the arches, the techniques of decoration would have all been within the local Christian vocabulary.
It borrows the form from a Byzantine martyrium, and a martyrium is simply a building that marks the place of a martyrdom or perhaps the burial place of a saint.
But instead of a burial site, the dome covers a massive rock, believed by Muslims to be the sacred place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven on his mystical night journey to pray with Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
The thing that makes this a uniquely Islamic building is the Arabic inscription that runs around it. That is, in effect, the sign that says, this is from a new culture. This isn't just somebody putting up words. This is somebody who cares. This is carefully composed. This is beautiful writing, calligraphy.
The interior inscription talks constantly about how God is one, not three. And this is clearly a rebuttal to Christianity, where the primary focus is that God sent down his son and God is tripartite. And for Muslims, this is anathema, God is one, not three. So clearly there is some kind of response to the Christian presence in the city. That inscription is made in gold cubes. They're small glass cubes with gold foil on them. They are by far the most expensive kind of cube. And in Christian buildings, often are used for halos or used behind the figure of Christ. In the Dome of the Rock, they're used for this inscription that runs around the building.
The Quran became the focus of devotion, but it also became the focus of art.
From the earliest times on, Muslims tried to make Quran manuscripts as beautiful as possible. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, is considered more important than all the other arts.
Today, one of the most well-respected Muslim calligraphers in the world is a convert from California. After teaching himself Arabic and working for over 20 years to perfect his art, Mohammad Zakaria finally traveled to Turkey to learn from the masters in 1983.
Basically, they made a deal, and they said, if you want to start all the way from the beginning, if you want to forget everything you learned about calligraphy for a while and sort of go from blank from start, just like you'd never picked up a pen before, and go through the lessons, he says, we'll be behind you all the way with this thing and help you out. But if you can't do that, have a nice time in Istanbul.
Zakaria accepted the challenge and began to learn his craft again, just as the first masters had before him.
Traditionally, Muslims always wrote with a reed pen. So you went out and you had reeds, or you imported reeds. Trimming the pen is even more important. Cutting the nib is even more important than actually the reed itself. And you have a tool on which you lay the reed when you cut it, and a special knife. And people collected these tools and gathered them in their little tool boxes.
Decorated with geometric designs and calligraphy, these toolboxes alluded to the practical use of the box, as well as the mystical power of the pen.
I've always had a facility for carving, but to cut a pen, you need a knife of a certain shape with a certain curvature in the blade. If it isn't that curvature, you're never going to cut a good tip.
In the 7th century, calligraphers wrote the Quran on treated animal skins called parchment.
The parchment was so important and so expensive that sometimes they even reused it, and they scraped away an earlier text and rewrote on top of it. And what's happened over time is the earlier text has darkened and you can actually see it underneath.
Most of them, they're readable or legible, they're practical, they're very, very interesting, but they don't rise to the level of art. But every now and then you see one of them, and you look at it and say, how on earth could this guy have done that, How'd they do their ink? How'd they cut their pen? We don't even know what angle the pens were cut. But it simply takes your breath away.
Islamic calligraphy was forever altered by a new invention from the East: paper.
Paper was introduced into the Islamic world in the 8th century due to interaction between China and the Islamic Caliphate. So the technique of paper making and actual paper makers were transported from China to Islamic lands, and paper just takes off in an Islamic context.
Just as important as the pen, the paper must be specially treated and prepared for calligraphy.
The man who taught me paper making or paper prep took me aside one day and said, I'm going to show it all to you. The paper is rubbed with a rag that has a bit of soap on it. The soap is dry rubbed on the rag, and it's a wool felt, and it's rubbed all over the paper to give it lubrication. Otherwise, the burnisher would snag the surface and just scratch the heck out of it. You want to have it smooth so the pen will glide across the surface, but you also don't want it slippery. You want to have the paper have a grab to it, just enough. So it holds the pen, doesn't slip, the ink sits on the surface, doesn't penetrate.
For the calligrapher, the process of copying the words of the Quran is, in itself, a meditation, a prayer, as God speaks through the pen.
And when you write, it just writes itself. You know, your own connection with it feels minimal because your concentration is concentration without thinking about it being concentration. It's what the old Arabs used to call the sahl al-mumtani, which is the ease that comes from practice that makes the hard thing look easy.
Now, it is impossible, if you are writing with a reed pen, to write more than 2 or 3 letters with one pen stroke. You have to recharge your pen. You have to dip it back into the ink. But the point with calligraphy is to not see those strokes, to not see the difference between one and the next, to imagine that it was written with an unending pen.
The old guys used to hold their breath under the theory that if you hold your breath when the pen is in motion, the breath goes down into your hand, through the pen and into the paper. And that's what would give it that life, and or breath as they would call it.
You are not looking to see any human interaction. You are looking to see the divine. When you see a manuscript that has all these little marks on it, that's a later manuscript because it's meant to be used by someone who's actually reading the text, not just using it to recall what he already had memorized.
We also have chapter headings that are illuminated. Illumination is a very important art form in the production of Islamic manuscripts. It serves to navigate the reader through the different sections of the text.
Because calligraphy basically is for reading, you know. It's not really about paper, pens, ink, and stuff like that. It's about meaning. And in my case, you know, I'm an American. Obviously, wherever I go, you know, I'm the pink one, you know, and you see a photograph of all the calligraphers, you know, and I'm in there, you know, and that guy looks really funny, you know. But it's, what am I doing with it? So I try to bring it out, what it means, and for me, that's absolutely the number one thing. I have access to this material, and I have to pass it on.
It is that divine presence embodied in the word that appears throughout Islamic art as writing becomes ornament.
I'm always moved when I hold a plate or a ceramic object or a metal pen case and think to myself, I'm holding the same thing that someone 1,000 years ago or 600 years ago held. I'm repeating the experience. I'm in a different place, a different moment in history. I'm a different human being. Everything about my world is different except that object, and that object comes forward intact. That's very moving.
Many buildings in the Islamic world are imbued with the voice of God as elaborate inscriptions speak from their stone walls.
They really are beautiful to look at. Even if one doesn't understand them, one can always appreciate their beauty.
And those inscriptions are usually in places that you cannot really read. You're not expected to read, but you expect to relate to them because you know what's going to be there. You just know what sorts of verses of the Quran are used, for example, in certain buildings, or in the case of Alhambra, it's the beautiful poetry.
The Alhambra was built in the 14th century by the last Muslim rulers of Granada, Spain. Part fortress, part palace, the Alhambra provided a princely refuge from the ravages of a fading empire.
In order to feel the Alhambra, to know what was meant, you have to go slowly and read the poetry that is written just at eye level inside the building. I could spend hours standing by a window, reading inscription, looking at this. That's why it was made for. It is meant to be lived in.
In some cases, some of the writing actually is as if the building is speaking about itself. So you have the dome or the wall or the fountain talking to the viewer and telling you what it's about and how it functions, or how it's set within the building itself.
The water basin whispers, melted silver flows through the pearls which it resembles in its pure dawn beauty. Water and marble seem to be as one.
The calligraphy, as it melds into ornament, the boundary between the two is so subtle that they become so extraordinarily good at just weaving shapes in and out of one another. Are these zoomorphic? Do they come out of vegetable life? You know, you can't really tell, and it doesn't make any difference because they arrive at a place that totally masks and has left the place from which they came.
As you saw, the writing occurred in a number of different places. In many of the different buildings here at the Great Mosque at Cordoba in Spain. Dome of the Rock, the exterior with Quranic writings, the cursive we see along the top edge right here. As discussed in the film and I discussed earlier, it was a critique of Christianity. This is on the left, on your left, yes, is a prayer lamp. And this lamp would have hung from the ceiling by cords. There's a quotation on it from the Quran that basically compares God's light with the light in a lamp. The burning wick, in this case, would dramatically illuminate the very words of Allah in this image on the left-hand side, and I think that's pretty extraordinary. What you see right here is what's called a blad. And that was something that Crusaders discovered and brought back to Europe. Basically, it is a sign of the family, I guess we would call it the family crest of the donor of this lamp. And that blazon led to heraldry, that idea in the West. Over on the right-hand side, we see a mihrab. Now, the mihrab is what marks a place on the wall on which to focus prayer. It also meant a place of honor, that very word. And this commemorated the presence of it also, in that regard, commemorated, I can say this, the very presence of the prophet in the midst of the followers, the prayers. So it had a very sacred significance. This mihrab that we see from Madrasa Imami in Isfahan, Iran, is about 11 feet tall. It's now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. What's extraordinary about it, I think, is the way that the cursive, the calligraphy on the outside edges is used. First of all, this describes the 5 pillars of faith. And then when we look around the pointed niche that are also an inscription that describes, are also sayings of the prophet in this case. And then in the very center is both in Kufic, which is a block script, and here in one type of cursive script is the idea that, in quotes, the mosque is the house of every pious person. What also I think is extraordinary in this is the combination of vegetal and geometric patterns, that we have these patterns that are moving in and out of and kind of moving around in and out of these geometric shapes here, along with the larger kind of areas and shapes that we see there. This kind of patterning is something that relates to the idea of, let's see if it's on my slide, here we go. Vegetal organic forms, a symbol of growth, change, movement. This represents, well, I'm reading what you're seeing up there, life's flow and unpredictability. It's contrasted by geometric forms which are visually predictable, angular and hard-edged, which represent static, fixed, and stable ideas of the faith. So if you take a look over on the left-hand side at this illuminated page from the Quran, what's I think is extraordinary is the complexity of the geometric patterns that are here, the mathematically kind of precise, yet this extraordinarily complex overlapping over and under. One line, if you follow it, will make its way all the way around here. And then in between are writings from the Quran, but also are these vegetal elements that seem to flow in and out of this, which to me is a really very direct kind of vision of this idea of the vegetal being life's flow, unpredictability, the organic being the hard elements of the Quranic faith. The right-hand side is a door jamb, a similar idea, or what we're seeing here is a stucco mihrab in the winter prayer hall, the Friday Mosque in Isfahan. This is made of stucco, plaster basically, creating this kind of intensely organic and flowing movement of forms throughout, broken up by these geometric areas here. Once again, one revealing the kind of very unpredictable and moving organic elements of life, and the other dealing with discipline of the faith. Even on the domes that we see here, this similar type of patterning goes on. This highly complex geometric organized pattern, a culture that was very much influenced by its scientists in this way, with these geometric spatial ideas made very clear amidst these very clear vegetal kind of forms. The idea of paradise, the enclosed and protected garden. The relationship between garden and paradise in the Quran is very clear and it's well formulated. Paradise derives from the Persian term Firdaus. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Later became Peri and Daisa. Peri is around and Daisa a wall, and came to mean a walled or protected enclosed space. And this idea was the very idea that Muhammad brought down from the mountain, describing heaven as a vegetal abundance, not available to typical, worshippers at the time in these very dry desert regions. And as we can see in the garden here, you can imagine the kind of glories of this experience, how extraordinary it would be to have water flowing in the, abundantly like this in a very dry climate. And just the abundance of flowers. And the idea of this being enclosed was something that was extraordinary in that you not only saw this experience and you were protected, buffeted from the desert winds and so on, but you also had the smells encased in this area, the smells of flowers and ripening plants and fruits and so on, that would be highly concentrated in this type of area. And so this then became that idea of paradise in Agra, the garden near the Taj Mahal. We can see this kind of formalized idea once again. It also is a type of bridge. I mean, visually you can actually see the line of water taking you to the mausoleum, and in the distance is, in a sense, a kind of visual bridge taking you from this world to this idea of eternity, to this visual paradise. I'd like to look very quickly at a couple of things in Al-Andalus in southern Spain. Cordoba, for one, is this hypostyle hall of columns, forest of columns, in a sense often described as numerous as the worshippers itself. And this idea of the horseshoe column that we can see here with it kind of this return here is something that the Islamic picked up from the Visigoth tribes, but really made it their own. And using shorter columns that were available to them, made the best of this by creating a double column with an opening, allowing creating air passage and so on through there, but also creating this kind of visually complex and extraordinary kind of experience when one enters this mosque. As you can see here, the area in front of the mihrab is a beautiful lobed dome with these ribbed arches here at 45-degree angles to each other, creating two inscribed squares, making up the octagon that one sees here. The amount of mosaics in this is extraordinary. Again, it's integrated with Arabic writing and so on. Here's the mihrab. Okay, looking at Alhambra in Spain, was a huge palace, a fortress, but some have described it because of the light and airy arches and the way it opens from space to space as a series of tents, and the way that the textile patterns really dematerialize the arcade, the elements above the arches that we see here really gives it this much lighter and airier kind of aspect. This in the Court of Lions is one of the few monumental or somewhat large figurative sculpture in the Islamic world. It has 4 directions, and these 4 directions lead to the 4 corners of the planet, etc. I mean, this is designed as a kind of earthly indication of what is to be seen in heaven, and it's supposed to be, in a sense, all-inclusive. Look at this. This is stucco patterning that we see up here. What that means is somebody took a lot of plaster and designed this kind of highly carved elements on this to, in a sense, appear to carve away the very surface of this arcade. These supported columns surrounding the courtyard had second floor windows. You can just see a few peeking out here. These second floor windows were called miradors, which framed intentional views. Some were quite extraordinary. These, in a sense, framed the views around the courtyard. And this is where women of the court, who did not appear in public, likely stood and viewed the affairs of the court. Not only did they stand by these windows away from everything, but there was lattice work in front of the windows so that one wouldn't, see them actually. So there was this very clear kind of division of the public and the private women. In this, the hall of the ambulatories, sorry, I don't speak, how do you say it, Jay? Okay, anyway, near the Palace of Lions, this is also in Alhambra. This is the reception hall and music room for the Caliphate. There are some 5,000 stucco marcarnas, which are these carved out kind of divots made out of stucco in the space here. Now they're not at all, they're not structural. What they do is basically carve away the space, allow areas for the light to bounce around and create this ephemeral sense of the night sky, of this idea of heaven in this masterpiece of late Islamic architecture. Okay, these are just some images from Persia. Here's an example of a few makarnas in this archway, this doorway here. And you can see along with the highly ornate work that it is an extraordinary kind of image of the vegetal or in the organic and so on in this piece. The last thing, the Ottoman Turks, looking at Hagia Sophia as an example to emulate and surpass, in this case, creating mausoleum that has a kind of geometric clarity and mathematical kind of spatial precision that the image of the mosque, that the image of Hagia Sophia did not provide. In this image, you can see on the left-hand side what it looks like today. On the right, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, what it would have looked like in its time. Let's end with this, the Taj Mahal. This is a mausoleum that's on a square, essentially, that's been cut away and altered in many ways with a dome on top. And the way it works in this sense, it has squinches, or it has corner supports to rest the dome on top. There's a kind of perfect mathematical precision. If you look at the center of this, from the bottom to the top is perfectly 1 to 1 to the horizontal, looking at the minaret type pillars on the outside here. With the cutaways, with the light marble form, it has this dematerialized heavenly kind of aspect to it. You add the water in the foreground and you get this sense of this kind of ephemeral experience. This was the king's wife's tomb, his favorite wife. And this is quite an extraordinary monument to her memory. And this says a lot, I think, about his love for her.